Voilà, mesdames et messieurs, nous allons ouvrir la discussion avec
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to open the debate with our hosts and with Dilma Rousseff, who is going to join us soon. And then you will have the opportunity also to ask your questions to the former president. Philippe Motta was just congratulating you for your courage to remain seated on these uncomfortable chairs. So on my right, Colin Gonsalves, who is a lawyer at the Supreme Court in India, defender of economic and social rights, human rights, and all these people who help people to get out of a very difficult situation. Then we have Christophe Golay. He is a researcher and an advisor to the Academy of International Humanitarian Rights in Geneva. She's a real star, Dilma Rousseff. She knows how to be waited for. So, Colin Gonsalves, a few words about this film. How far is this film representative of the situation, generally speaking, in India?
Well, this film is actually very unique in the sense that it captures a very exciting time in India, where we've had two parties representing basically the rich and no party representing the poor. And along comes Arvind Kejriwal, who then changes the situation completely.
Je vous en prie.
Yeah. And then you have Arvind Kejriwal come and change the situation completely. And he taught us a lesson, that is to say, an NGO, a civil society movement, individual people can transform their ideas and can transform society by converting a civil society movement into a political party and then take power. Very often, and I suppose this is true of the developed world as well, people feel very atomized and isolated, and they feel that they can't have a role in larger social change and larger political movements, and feel that it's impossible to start a political party and really run for office and win. And you saw Arvind Kejriwal never stood for elections before that, and he, in a very strident way, in a very attractive way, in a very charismatic manner, switched from a non-entity, a simple NGO, into a party that won power not once but twice in Delhi, and the most historic mandate, where 67 out of 70 seats by a party committed to social change, representing the poor in the capital of India.
Christophe Golay, j'aimerais que vous expliquiez en quoi l'action de Colin Gonsalves
how Colin Gonsalves' action is exceptional in terms of its success. This is an exceptional panel. And why? Well, for the last 15 years, I've been with Jean with all his missions on the right to food, and India and Brazil are the two best examples that exist across the world, to fight hunger with an approach based to the right to food. So what Colin represents is the approach based on the law, with an access to justice, with very progressive judges in India for the last 15 years who've been actually focusing on the right to food and recognizing that the right to life that's in the Constitution is a right to actually dignity. And it's only a few countries in the world where the judges have said, right to life is not just to right to not be killed arbitrarily, it's a right to a dignified life, and so that's why they protected also the right to water, the right to health, the right to housing, the right to food. And in his exceptional case, I mean, he actually lodged the complaint in 2001 before the Supreme Court. The result is more than 200 judgments where the judges in India have forced governments of the different states of India to set up food distribution programs with 280 million children who receive school food at school after fighting for 15 years. So this is a phenomenal result. Through Colin's work and also the fact that the judges recognized the need to protect the right to food. And in India, as well as in Brazil, what's unbelievable is the power of civil society in all the countries we went to with Jean Ziegler, is the two countries as well, perhaps Bolivia as well, where the civil society has the most power. And the campaign on the right to food in India for the last 15 years puts a pressure on the government so that they actually execute the judgments and actually implement the campaign for food. This is phenomenal. And the last thing is the international dimension of these, the impact. And these are not small countries. These are very vast countries. So of course it has international repercussions. And when the food distribution program was launched in 2013, there were negotiations in Bali, and some states were saying the program must stop because it's not normal to India to actually pay its farmers and to redistribute the food at lower prices. This goes against the law of trade, and India said the right to food is not negotiable. And from then on, the states have the right to actually make up stocks and to actually buy up food from the local farmers and to give them a decent price and to redistribute at lower prices to the people. So tell us, Colin, how do you use this right to food? So in Geneva, at the United Nations, people tend to think it's theoretical and they don't think it's going to have a real practical effect. And you say this is actually, there is a legal driver behind all of this.
First of all, we didn't come to the UN or Geneva. We used our constitutional court. And I want you to understand the magnitude of the problem. Switzerland is 8 million. Brazil is 200 million. India is 1,200 million. Close your eyes and imagine 50% of that, 500 million people living in hunger. Close your eyes and imagine a village in India where a little girl gets up, sees her father squatting outside the house, realizes that he's got no employment for the day, and she goes to the well to drink water and drink water and drink water because she knows that she's not going to get food that day. It's a crime of enormous proportions. 3,000 children die every day because of malnutrition-related problems. So we go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court judge then said, when he saw the case and he heard our arguments, he said, this cannot be. The judiciary must intervene. And to cut a long story short, what the judges did was, we had a public distribution system which the World Bank and the IMF, incidentally, was trying to close down, like they did in Mexico and many other countries, where grains are given to people in something like 40,000 ration shops. So they give you grain, they give you rice, they give you sugar. The World Bank said, close it down, it's a waste of public money. You have got to cut social spending. And the Supreme Court expanded it. And today we have a law in our country expanding it from 400 million people to 700 million people, the first victory. For children in school, you had the midday meal, which is a handful of rice and a little bit of lentils on top. World Bank closed that program down almost when the Supreme Court intervened. And today it's working at 80%. Right across the country, students get their midday meal. Women get supplementary nutrition. Little children get supplementary nutrition. And pregnant women get a little amount of money and food just before their pregnancy so that their children are not born underweight and so on. So the Supreme Court actually transformed the situation and made the government spend billions of dollars more than they would have, spend it on a social program on the right to food. Today it's ingrained It's ingrained in constitutional law. It's ingrained in the minds of people that you're not depending on a dole or a benefit or a handout from government, but you have a constitutionally given right under the Constitution of India, fundamental right to the right to food. That's what was achieved through the court case.
Le lien entre la faim et la corruption.
The link between hunger and corruption is not obvious everywhere, but in certain situations, circumstances is the case. Mrs. President, when you take the example of Brazil, is there a link between corruption and hunger? Are there circle of people who contribute to hunger?
Não há necessariamente uma relação entre fome e corrupção.
It's not necessarily a link.
É haver uma posição política que não considera que é necessário
It's possible to have a political behavior that confirms that food security is assured and that the hunger is eradicated. It has to do with a political position, political stand, in order to prevent, to take the decision to set up programs to address the whole population in order to increase hunger. Of course, sometimes certain funds which should be dedicated to fight against hunger are used out of corruption for other things. Of course, this is a kind of corruption which exists very often, is the clientelism.
Da resolução do problema da fome em proveito político de algum líder político.
If you want to solve the problem of hunger, and the problem is we have to solve the problem with using a system. We created a digitalized platform.
E criamos cartão que é de débito.
This digitalized structure, we created a bank card. So people receive this card and have access to a public bank, Caixa Econômica Federal, and receive
este recurso para ela. E ela
in the agencies of that
tem
bank
também de
the funds
algumas
which
coisas.
are
Ela não recebe simplesmente. Ela tem
for this person, and this person have to answer to certain conditions. Like, for instance, the children must go to school. They have to be present about 85% of the time at school. They have to have received 3 vaccines, and if the woman is pregnant, she has to have 3 medical examination before giving birth.
Eu nunca cheguei a ver no Brasil desvio de fundos, pelo menos no meu período. Pode ter havido antes.
There is in Brazil, there was a clientelism.
Não era em cima da fome que ocorria os processos de corrupção. Em cima da fome ocorreu processos de uso político.
So on the issue of hunger, so there was a political use made. That's the cronyism I talked to you about. So, there's been rebellion, of course, because there's such social differences. During your mandate, there was the scandal Petrobras around corruption. Everybody's asking themselves, how can you say that how can you pretend you ignored all this? I mean, you were president of Petrobras, president of Brazil. So, what do you answer to this question?
Vamos discutir corrupção, então. Perfeitamente. Então, eu acho que o maior...
La révolte concerne aussi le fait de cette inégalité sociale colossale.
So, there's a colossal inequality. That's the question. So, I don't think it just has to do with social inequalities when you talk about corruption, because in this society, money, has a completely different dimension, and the people want to actually take advantage of money without having even to work to obtain the money. So I believe. No, I mean, no, I'm sorry. I mean, please let me answer your question. So, so you're asking me a complex question, and you want easy, straightforward answer. No, I also I have the right to answer, to give you complex answers. No, you asked me a question. I want to be able to answer your question.
Não é simples essa pergunta. Eu vou explicar por quê. Porque ela tem dois pesos.
So I'm going to tell you why. Because again, there's different level playing fields. I didn't see anyone ask why the large corporations, such as Santiazim, Austo, and all these companies, they are part of the international financial system. And again, there's incredible, unbelievable corruption. I mean, it goes very deep down. And the issue of the subprimes, and there was at the time there was no. Corruption. So I'm in favor of investigations into acts of corruption. So we have to actually ask for investigations in those companies that are actually involved in corruption. And because I have actually had a law passed against criminal organizations and also whistleblowing as well. So my government is to punish those people who are corrupt and who are corrupt others. The others, those who are being taken to court are those only, who are corrupted. But now those who actually are guilty of corrupting should also be charged in court. It doesn't mean that I agree with the political use that was made. But so everywhere across the world, and never anyone asked whether, the central banks were kept abreast of the corruption. Did they know what was happening? I mean, did they know that this corruption actually led to the financial crisis? No, nobody asked the banks, and nobody asked, the different the stock exchanges, the regulating agents that had the obligation to actually regulate markets. Nobody asked these people whether they knew what was going on. I believe that there is a difference between a board and an executive board, and there are differences between the agent, the manager, and the shareholder. And again, the executive committee, knows much more what's happening than members of the board. So the answer may be very easy. I mean, corruption is hidden. Corruption is nothing visible. It's not transparent. And corruption, employs highly sophisticated mechanisms to not only corrupt, but also to hide the cases of acts of corruption. And the corruption could actually be stopped. So, how did we discover corruption at Petrobras? It's not by actually carrying out investigations in Petrobras. I mean, it was through actually a trader who actually who was doing managed illegally the exchange of dollar exchange. So it's not surprising that someone, whether it be in Brazil or somewhere else, I mean, we have a federal police, we have also a public ministry, a judiciary system that was actually investigating. Otherwise, we would not have found out. We wouldn't have shed light on this. And now the role of politicians, which is to fight corruption. Of course, there's a political usage made of corruption, and we have a president called and so also actually committed suicide because he was accused of being corrupted, but history showed that he was not corrupt.
Christophe Golay, comment est-ce que vous expliquez la survivance
how do you explain the ongoing of all-around corruption? I mean, you have almost all parties in Brazil that have been involved in corruption. So how does corruption survive in such a country? So we could also talk about India, of course. Yes.
En Inde,
India,
le cas est aussi parti parce qu'il y avait une corruption immense.
I mean, there was huge corruption in the distribution program of food programs. That's where it started. So it started in a situation where people were dying for food, and 5 miles down the road there were available stocks of food, and they weren't being handed out. So the main, again, we were trying to, it was fighting hunger and fighting corruption, and so much so that one of the objectives of the food campaign was to pass a Right to Information Act. And in India, anyone can ask, ask questions about the budget, who's responsible for what, and so this is the World Food Program. So you asked the question whether corruption is a cause for hunger. So these are the two major thinkers of the fighting are Brazilian and an Indian. Jojo de Castro in the 50s, who wrote a geography of hunger, and the Indian is Amartya Sen, an economist who wrote in the 80s on famine in India, in Bangladesh and Ethiopia. And what comes out from their writings is that hunger is not connected to food availability, and they both are saying there's enough food for everyone, and nevertheless people go hungry. So the major problem is, the major issue is access to food. And how do you gain access to food? Is through resources, through social aid. And the Jojo de Castro said that hunger in Brazil and across the world is due to exclusion, political exclusion, social exclusion, economic exclusion, cultural exclusion, and discrimination. And across the world, 70% of people who are hungry are women and young girls, mostly because they're being discriminated against, and they don't have access to salaries, they don't have access to land ownership. So we have to actually see the impact of the phenomenon. And so corruption as a phenomenon per se can have a destructive effect. For instance, corrupt judges are going to prevent people having access to justice, or at the local level, corrupt people are not going to hand out food to the people who are worth nothing. You're totally excluded from a political standpoint, and they have no interest in helping. So each phenomenon, whether it be climate change, or it can be analyzed through the impact of access to food and on these exclusions and discrimination. Allow me to just revisit something that was just said, is the political will. And the film, you can see that Arvid, does his campaign and promises to cut the price of electricity by half and to provide 700 liters of water. And when I was with Ziegler, in 2002 in Brazil, and the objective of his campaign was to say he wanted to give all Brazilians, 3 meals a day. That was what his campaign was based on. And so, this was 2002 in Brazil, and there was Ziegler, in front of the television cameras explaining the problem and comparing Brazil with sub-Saharan Africa, and there was incredible political will. Someone said Lula lost a sister when he was small because she was suffering from hunger. And so there's a definite commitment that is phenomenal, impressive. And you don't find this in other countries. So this Brazil, with a few other countries in South America, is an unbelievable example of will. And we did another, we went to Niger, and the president didn't recognize that there was a problem of food security, and it was a taboo to talk about hunger, and Jojo de Castro started there. Hunger was a taboo, so they have simply broken down the taboo, and from then on they made incredible progress. I mean, let's talk about India now.
Colin Gonsalves, on parlait à l'instant de volonté politique chez Rousseff ou chez Golay. Dans quelle mesure elle existe dans les élites indiennes? Est-ce qu'elles considèrent que c'est un problème ou est-ce qu'il y a une forme de cynisme dans une grande partie des élites indiennes considèrent qu'au fond ça n'est pas un problème prioritaire?
How do you see that?
Well, India is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. The Indian administration, politicians, the cabinet, the union cabinet, the state cabinets don't think it's a problem. Do they want to solve it? No. Do the people of India and the film you saw, Arvind Kejriwal and so on, are they determined to solve the problem? Yes. Does it bleed India? Yes. Are social programs impossible because of corruption? Yes. But I'd like to look at a little wider dimension of corruption. We had a system in India, social democracy, like you had in Europe, like you have in Europe, up to 1990s. And then we had a corrupt way of thinking, which was called globalization. Now, you in Geneva would say globalization, that sounds like a good thing. But you come to the developing world, you come to India, and you'll understand what that meant. Globalization was the dismantling of the social democratic system. And it was the institutionalization. It was the institutionalization of an economic and political theory which said, it is no longer the duty of the state to look after its citizens. Social democracy said, take the whole country along, rich and poor alike. Globalization says the engine of change is the rich and the upper middle classes. It is no longer the duty of the state to give you food. It is no longer the duty of the state to give you hospitals and medicines. It is no longer the duty of the state to give you schools with teachers and blackboards. It is no longer the duty of the state to give you housing. It was a very high-level political, economic, corrupt theory. Corruption flows from that. Because if it is now under globalization, if the greatest good is not the happiness of the people, the greatest good is to make GDP go up, increase profits, increase your wealth of the nation, and not the happiness of the people, not food security, not housing rights, not health rights, and so on. If that is the greatest goods, you are, by your economic and political theory, institutionalizing corruption. Please understand that. So don't look at corruption as an individual thing of people putting money in banks. And believe me, Indians put a lot of money in the Swiss banks. And the Swiss banks turned a blind eye to all kinds of money flowing into the Swiss banks. And the moment the Indian Supreme Court turned to the banks of Switzerland, so it's all around you. It's here in Geneva. It's here in Europe. It's everywhere. The moment the Indian Supreme Court turned to Switzerland, I'll finish in a second. The moment they turned, we took all our money out of the Swiss banks and sent it to Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So corruption is a huge issue. It can't be solved by law alone. Yes, it requires, and the Indian lesson is very important. It requires social change, social movement, insurrection. It requires fundamental transformation of society.
Dilma Rousseff, est-ce que vous êtes aussi critique que Colin Gonsalves sur la mondialisation, parce que vous avez dirigé une des plus grandes puissances de la Terre, 200 millions d'âmes, ces fameux BRICS,
one of these four BRICS countries, Brazil, India, Russia, and South Africa, and all these countries benefited from globalization, and a lot of Chinese also had the opportunity to develop within the globalization. Are you as critical as that? Of course I am. I was expecting that. I'm even more critical than Mr. Colin Gonsalves, because I understand perfectly well the pictures he's using to describe globalization. Globalization is a financial process which gives the benefits to the productive sectors who want a minimum intervention of state. They say that the states do not have to take care of the poorest. The state does not have to take care of the medical care. He doesn't have to. Yes, the state has just to pay for goods. And this is what is happening in Brazil now. We approved a constitutional change, which is the example, it's a model for that. We wanted to increase the spending of Brazil for health, education, insurance, and social health, and science and technology, and housing. all these spendings which are not of financial nature. So you have this project in Brazil now to deconstruct the whole social policy. So we put into place. And you know why it doesn't happen now? Because the work fighting against poor poverty was in all our programs, and we wanted to create schools to teach the poorest, and we have opened schools with the aim of vocational training in the poorest region of Brazil. And
da construção de casas próprias.
Whom would you target to give the opportunity to build their own houses? The poorest, of course. Why? Because you have to universalize that with the poorest. You have to start with the poorest because they are the poorest of the poorest. If you don't start with them, the inequalities are going to go on to increase, and I agree with Colin Gonsalves. I think there is a perverse situation in our countries and least developed countries, and this affects also the population of the richest countries, the inequalities. Why do the salaries remain the same? Why is precarious work, jobs permanent? Why are the people replaced by IT programs? And in our countries, there are people who are hungry, are going hungry. So there is no commitment to put an end to hunger. And this is something very serious on the ethical point of view. When the FAO withdraw us of this hunger map, because we managed to take the country out of this hunger map, it was a huge success, this program. So systematically, immediately afterwards, we started to improve. And Brazil also came out of extreme poverty. So extreme poverty and poverty are all linked. But, as we were saying, although we managed to put an end to poverty and extreme poverty, but this is only the beginning of our work, because those persons want to have access to services, quality services. They want a good education, a quality education. They want to access to health care. They want to have opportunities to see their children go to university. And when we have such policies enabling a couple, enabling to somebody to decide who is going to university, those who would go to university at that time, thanks to our work, were sometimes indigenous people or black people who would go to university. So we changed the color of public university, because the colors of the university was exactly like the majority of the Brazilian population. And I was in a training which was fantastic. It was a training for doctors, because we also created programs which allowed to guarantee access to people with low income to go to university. So I was in one of these trainings, and a young black doctor said the following thing, and this is typical for Brazil. She said that these inequalities in this big house, the big house is getting bigger when the people become doctors, and the big house was the big house was the house of the owners, of the masters, and the small house was the house of the slaves. So when the slaves can go in the big house and become doctors, so a part of my impeachment had to do with the fact that we invested a lot of money in social programs, and because we were successes And we never hesitated to put at the core of our proposals the fight to put an end to misery and hunger in order to draw people out of poverty in Brazil and to start to increase the living standards to the people so that the people can access to housing, education, which are the most fundamental things so that the people can access to happiness, so food, housing,
Colin.
and health.
C'est un meeting, hein? Vous ne vous attendiez pas à faire un meeting à Genève. Colin Gonsalves, vous vouliez réagir?
Can I say something?
Bien sûr.
Madam President, I would like you to know, Lula inspired India. What you did, what your party did, what you showed us the slideshow, it inspired us in India. It was fantastic. And I do hope, Madam President, in 2018, 2019, whenever your presidential elections are there, I hope Lula will be back in the presidential palace.
Ele vai estar, Colin. O Lula é candidato em 2018 a presidente do Brasil.
There's only one little thing I would say, Madam President. Apart from giving people things, you give people education, housing, right? We must do something fundamental. We must give land to the people. We must give institutional reform. We must give constitutional reform. We must do such reform that should another party come to power, a terrible, conservative, retrogressive party comes to power, they'll be finding it very difficult to dismantle the system because you have given power to the people. That's my only suggestion.
On a beaucoup parlé de volonté politique et du pouvoir.
You have been talking about political will and about power. I would like to ask a question about public opinion. I don't want to be too biased. One of your supporters, Mrs. Rousseff, told me just before, I'm a poor Brazilian. When I go into a plane, the Brazilians of middle-class Brazilians do not like that. Oh, they think anybody can go on a plane. Doesn't this reveal a mindset which exists not only in Brazil, in India, and also in other, but also in middle class? The family of my father was from Iran, and I could see these differences in Switzerland. You have many inequalities, but more or less we are quite egalitarian in our ideas, and we are quite a democratic country. But I see my Iranian family, many of them would consider that a woman is a bit less worth than a man. It's a bit like that. They also consider that the poor is not as worthy as a rich, wealthy person. And do not such mindsets, such ideas go on existing in India and in Brazil. I'm not only talking about elites, I'm talking of the main part of the public opinion.
There is an opinion in many parts of the world that women are somehow inferior to men. So that when women politicians come up the ladder, struggling against even more terrible odds than men have to suffer, when they come up, they are 100 times more remarkable than men. And we've had Indira Gandhi as a Prime Minister of India, and she was a very strong Prime Minister. You have a woman Prime Minister in Bangladesh. We had a woman Prime Minister in Sri Lanka. So in our part of the world, the women are very powerful, even though they face discrimination, hostility, hate speech. Like I'm sure, Madam President, you must have faced in Brazil as well. I don't know the situation there, but I could imagine that you must be a very strong and powerful woman and a very charismatic woman to come against all these male biases and become the president of Brazil. So when they win, then you can make out that they are very remarkable, very charismatic, very tough women, and they've struggled against all odds. And I think it's changing now in the world. India is a very young country. Half of its population of 1,200 million people, half is below the age of 25, so we are a young country. And all the old ideas that men dominate, women must stay in the house, etc., all that will be changing in the next 10 years when women come up in power. The future of the world, really, because men have really had it. They've spoiled this world for too long. Women power is going to change the world. If the environment has to be saved, if the planet has to be saved, women power must dominate in the world. And that's the way I see it.
Merci. Et ça fait suite.
And this follows on a wonderful tribute, Colin, you made to mothers when you said that the mothers, always use whatever money they have for their children. But again, back to the issue between rich and poor and this mentality that is so deeply embedded. I mean, is it a reality? Yes, allow me to just say one thing. So these two examples are exceptional. They are unique in their kind, because they aimed at helping the most vulnerable. And this is not being done in other countries. And internationally speaking, for 15 years, we had the Millennium Goals, and the reduce was to actually cut in half the number of people suffering from hunger. And most of the people who are no longer hungry, those who have succeeded, were not the poorest. Now, since 2015, we have a new Millennium Goals for Sustainable Development, and the objective for 2030 is to eradicate hunger and misery. So there's no ifs or buts. So now we have to reach out to the most vulnerable, the poorest. That is why these examples, Brazil and India, are exceptional. And the Brazil has set up a center of excellence to fight hunger a few years ago, and this center trains representatives from other countries to fight hunger, and this is an example to follow. To finish, we're talking about Geneva, the financial capital, and the role of Geneva in corruption. So I want to talk about a positive role of Geneva. 15 years ago, there's Denis van der Weyt. He may be in this room, and he actually set up a NGO, Antenna, that does wonderful things. And 15 years ago, Antenna International and Denis van der Weyt decided to give 5,000 francs to Colin, for his case against hunger. It cost, to initiate proceedings in the Supreme Court, 5,000 francs. And today we're talking about 300 million children who actually have a school lunch. So we can have a phenomenal impact if we know exactly where to invest our money.
Voilà.
So, ladies and gentlemen, what's wonderful about the festival is that everybody has the right to speak up. So now the term has come to give you the opportunity to ask questions to us, to the panels. But again, make sure that your questions are brief, and let's allow everyone to have their say. So we'll start, with the lady who actually put her hand up, yes? So we're going to bring the microphone to you.
Darius, j'aurais souhaité poser une question à monsieur qui a votre main.
I'd like to ask a question to Colin Gonsalves. So corruption in Switzerland and in Western countries, is it institutional or does it have to do with something else? I think so. So corruption. Corruption. Yes, some arguments were given to explain this, but corruption in Switzerland and in Western countries, is its origin institutional or does it for other reasons? I don't know if you've understood me or not. I don't know if you'd like to answer that question. Yes. Okay.
Madam, I understood your question. In India, you have corruption of a petty kind, where a policeman will take money. If you have a traffic violation, he'll take money in the street itself. He won't bother to hide the money and so on. And there's institutional corruption. Institutional corruption has always existed in developed societies. You'll hear Americans say that, America is very corruption-free. It's institutionalized in these places. And it's been institutionalized for a very, very long time in the banking system and so on. We could not speak of these things because Europe went through a period of great calmness for 20 years. But today, look around you, look at Italy, 40% unemployment rate. Look at Greece, look at Spain. Look at, the countries of Europe. The young are unemployed, they're out of work. And is it because the countries are poor? Is it because their economies are failing? It's because corruption, institutionalized corruption in the banking system particularly, has become so extreme. That system is no longer capable of meeting the aspirations of the young. You have to change, structurally change society. I'm a person, actually, I'm not very happy with capitalism and so on, and I know that I'm in the heartland of capitalism. I would like something like social democracy or something like social democracy where capitalism, there are reins on capitalism and great checks and balances. But that period went with globalization. Make money. Money is a god. Money is the greatest good. As long as you do that, nobody will check your banks, your books of accounts, your corrupt practices, and so on and so forth. So it's institutionalized deeply. And it will take a social revolution in Europe and America and India and Brazil. It will take a social revolution where young people take to the streets against the system that will fundamentally change. Otherwise, bankers are very resilient. The institutionalization of corruption is a very tight thing. It is incapable of breaking. It will only break through social movements and change. That's the only way to do it. So be prepared in Europe. Young people of Europe, try and imagine 10 years down the line, what is this world going to be? Forget climate change. Climate change, in any case, takes us to the brink of the precipice. Forget climate change. 10 years down the line, what will be my future and the future of my children? And I say, from a developing country point of view, you have no option but to think of social movement, social change, rapid, large-scale movement of people to fight for your rights. And it's a very bitter battle, but it's a battle to the end. And we must fight it.
Madame ici. Ouais. Madame, s'il vous plaît, Madame qui est ici.
So yes, the lady there.
Voilà.
Merci.
Thank you.
Je vais poser des questions en portugais.
I'm going to ask my question in Portuguese because it's for Mrs. Rousseff.
Primeiro, eu quero dizer que
Dilma, I'd like to start by telling you that I deeply admire all the work you and Lula accomplished. Sorry, I'm very emotional here. So from the very bottom of my heart, I would like for this work to continue because as a Brazilian, I left my country when I was 27 years old, and I saw with my own eyes how the process you've described. I've seen, the results, how well it worked in the different states of Brazil where I have a family, and they've told me about the incredible progress. So here comes my question.
Alguém que militava pelo PT. Eu tinha
So a person who was an activist for the Labour Party. I was 18 years ago. I was also an activist for the UPT. I participated in political campaigns of Lula, and I believed in this dream. And I'd like to ask you, Madam, as you were at the head of this country, and you were part and parcel of this country. So I'd like to know what happened with the UPT ideal. I'm not talking about Lula's ideal, but I'd like to know what happened of the UPT ideal. Well, I hope to be able to answer your question. I believe that UPT's ideal. It's very difficult for a given party or government. So I think the ideal of UPT becomes the ideal of transforming Brazil. So I think there's going to be so a PT can actually grow, but neither myself nor Lula would we have had access to government without the PT? So within, that's what inspired us to actually go into politics. And what I believe that there was, something that was extremely interesting that happened in Brazil, as we in 2003 until 2015, 2016, we were part of government. People didn't remember what life was like before we came on board. People believed that their lives was just the same. And when people started traveling, getting on planes, yes, the middle class in Brazil did not appreciate this at all, and this has become actually a motorway. And why? Because to travel by plane was an event, something unbelievable, phenomenal, and we've actually changed this relationship around the cultural content. And a person, working, as a maid, could now, buy a plane ticket, could actually board a plane and go and, visit her family, her cousins, her aunts living, southeast, northwest of the country. But in addition to this, the dream of this party made it possible to make this dream come true. I mean, we were looking forward to the future because we had many conquests, and so we've made incredible progress. But again, these what we've accomplished is being jeopardized, and we have to think forward, think forth. And for this, the PT, the future will be a new dream, new ideal, and new conquests stand ahead of us, because transforming Brazil. And again, the end of misery is only the beginning. So when we're implementing these ideas, we are actually setting up a new world. And these accomplishments, people feel it's absolutely normal to travel by plane. People don't want to actually go back. Colin's right. I mean, some things have been acquired and forever. I mean, those who've actually obtained land ownership through the Land Reform Act will not agree to losing their land. All of those who obtained with their own participation, because nothing was actually given out, but it was through the participation of many people and organizations of grassroots movement, and their accomplishments are everlasting. But the people want more, because I mean that is typical of human beings. You always want more. So what happened with the PT, and so it continues thinking of how we're going to what's in store, decide what's in store for the future. Just from the education standpoint, education for Brazil is an incredible challenge that stands ahead of it. So why? Because let's we look at everything that's being done, and why would we not these recipes? We could perhaps finance the income we have from oil. We could actually use it to fund education, because all the when we're talking about the distribution of income, not resources, income. So the process of distribution of wealth cannot be questioned, and the value acquisition process for each individual. I mean, for us, education is a fundamental value. Education is guaranteed, and there's no going backwards. I mean, we're talking about social advancement. And number two, education is the reason why our country has all the necessary conditions to become a developed country, so that we actually produce technology, innovation, and science. And how? Well, by educating the people. The people must be educated, but not just any education. We're talking about quality education. As Lula was saying, I have not actually joined the government. This is a popular Brazilian expression that said, mukifo. What is it? You know, a small hut, and we didn't gain power to just give little huts to people. No, it's to give two-bedroom flats and kitchens to all families. So what happened with the PT? We're going to have to work on these programs and new projects, action plans with a new future, and we have to be extremely careful. Because, there are people who want to destroy our projects, who are against us. That's what they're trying to do. And so, we have in our hands democracy, and I'd like to thank Colin Gonsalves. I'd like to thank him for what he said when he talks about Lula, who inspired India. Thank you. From the very bottom of my heart, thank you, Colin.
Em outubro de 2018, e conto com você, viu? Grande encontro com a democracia no Brasil.
We had a huge, in 2019, we will have a huge meeting with democracy in Brazil.
Alors, madame, vous aviez levé la main depuis un moment, donc s'il vous plaît.
This lady here, please, you will receive a microphone.
First, I want to thank you both for coming here to Geneva to talk to us. And I'm going to do the rest in Portuguese. Vocês são exemplos para a gente, para todo mundo. É uma honra de escutar isso. Eu sou americana, estou muito preocupada com o meu país.
I am American, and I'm very worried about what is going to happen in my country, because they are going to do the contrary what you ask for. How can you influence this balance? This is a question which is for Dilma Rousseff. Yes, the question is for both. Colin Gonsalves, you can have the floor because you haven't been speaking so much in comparison to Dilma Rousseff.
Vous avez trop cédé aux femmes, vous voyez, dans vos discours précédents.
You have given too much to the women in your previous speech.
Ma'am, you're worried. You're an American and you're worried about what Trump is going to do to your country.
No.
Yeah, ma'am, because as an Indian, I wanted to say we are worried what Mr. Trump is going to do to India. And it's like many leaders of the world. I don't want to mention names. It's a new generation of leaders who don't care for human rights, don't care for law, don't care for logic. Very vulgar leaders, very rude leaders, very arrogant leaders who have their fingers on the nuclear button. So we are living through a very dark period. All that I can say for Americans, that just as there's a Mr. Trump, there are millions and millions of lovely Americans. And just like there's a leader in my country who's a great friend of Mr. Trump, there are lovely, lovely Indians who struggle every day of their lives for human rights. We must have a great globalization and a great solidarity of the working people. The working people, the poor, the dispossessed, because we are the majority of the world. We are 75% of the world, and yet 25% of the world is represented and they speak for the whole world. So we are the world, and we have to reclaim what is ours. We have to reclaim our rights. We have to reclaim our political rights. And a time must come where we have a political movement and political leadership that speaks of genuine globalization, not globalization of richness and wealth, but a globalization of human rights as well. And that period will come. It'll take a long time. People say we are in the dark period. It's true we are in a dark period, but maybe we must go through the darkness to the light. And that's the struggle that we take all together, all of us together.
Merci. Alors, nous vous laisserons la conclusion, Dilma, mais avant, Christophe.
You will have the conclusion, but before that, we give the floor to Christophe. What is happening in the United States and in many other countries in Europe and elsewhere is a phenomena which is the result of World War II. Is too far in the past. It's soon going to be 70, 80 years, and we are no more in this mood where you have to prevent the worst of happening. So one has forgotten as a society what a world war can mean and be, and so we are in such an era where everything is possible, where all extremes are possible, all the racism and discrimination are possible. So what I can see is a return to the local. whatever happens, they will have a decrease of the attraction for international activities, for foreign countries. But this return to local can also be a source for diversity. For instance, the food sovereignty, which we hasn't been spoken of, but being advocated by lots of peasants across the world, farmers across the world. So you have to have a diversity in production, and this can be education, culture, health. So we mustn't be too much afraid by this return to locality, to the local aspect, because it's not only somebody who is just coming back and protecting himself. But I would like to come back to what can be done here in Geneva. We have been speaking of India and Brazil from 2010 to 2014. I was the president of an NGO who is dealing with food, and with the Swiss section, we made a survey to see the impact on Geneva of the food rights across the world. So you can have an impact in your pension funds, for instance, or when land is being grabbed on a large scale. So when you go to the website of these NGOs, you have a few tools everybody in Geneva can use, asking its pension fund or its bank not to have an impact, a negative impact on other countries. Dilma Rousseff, when I met you yesterday, we were talking about a great Brazilian poet you have quoted in your first speech as a president. And this afternoon, we were talking about your courage facing torture. So the courage for you now, presently, at this stage of your political life, what is it? For me, and thank you for this question, for me, courage is to fight for my country. Presently, we have to fight for democracy in Brazil. And fighting for democracy means to put oneself, to be exposed to risks. And as I just said before, Brazil has a meeting with democracy in 2018. And it's a new chance for us to prevent that a second coup takes place, which could be to exclude Lula from the campaign. We have again the possibility to elect a new president in Brazil, and we need this democratic process in order to be all together. And through this process, we could restructure our country. But I would like also to speak 2 minutes about globalization. I agree with Colin Gonsalves, and I think that the only real globalized aspect is the financial aspect, because we're witnessing this very serious problem, which is immigration. Presently, we do not have liberty of person, and we are talking globalization exists only with the globalization of the markets, but it's not a globalization of the opportunities. And I remember very well that little time after the crisis of 2008 and 2009 at the G20 summit, which was something new at that time, the 20 main economies across the world, representing different regions of the world, didn't represent only the countries. What was at stake during this G20 summit was to increase the regulation of the financial sector, because it was being recognized by a few people that the prevalence of the financial sector led to great inequalities. And when there is inequality, that means that the governments do not answer to the demands of the population and to the requests of the population. And when they don't do not respect the needs of the population, so the government is no more relevant and policy is no more relevant. And when policy is no more relevant, that means that many things can appear. For instance, this expression of an absence of policy, a lack of symbols, and people who become like saviors of our land, of our country, and also far-right extremists. I'm not talking of a position when I'm talking from right positioning. I'm talking about the denial of human rights, denying the fact that we can look together for solution to problems through a political and social participation. And I think that recently several facts express this loss of importance of a nation or a country which adopted the neoliberalism, which increased the inequalities and do not give any perspective to the young people. And then you have, as a result, Brexit and different forms of extremism, like election of people who do not express the hopes of the world. In Brazil, there was a coup and the attempt to prevent that we can again go to the government.
Je vous propose une conclusion et je vous propose pour l'exercice d'enlever tous vos casques.
Conclusion. So you can put off your headphones. I suggest to everybody to put off your headphones. I think you have learned French, so I leave the conclusion to you. And since we are here in Geneva, would you please say a few words in French?
J'avais un sentiment.
I had
C'est très bien en français.
a feeling. I think that we are all people, persons who think that the world must transform for the better, for the happiness of the people, but above all, so that there are equal opportunities. I know that the persons are all different from each other, but I know if you give equal opportunities to the people, they will develop themselves and they look for their destiny in an autonomous way and with a good self-esteem. And I did a big effort for you. Thank you.
Voilà, mesdames, messieurs, je vous remercie infiniment et merci au festival de nous avoir offert ce moment.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the festival for having given us this opportunity to talk.